Perfect. So, hello and welcome everyone. On behalf of the Icon Photographic Materials Group, thank you for joining us today. My name is Ioannis, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the events coordinator of the group. And as it's the first time we join the group as group on this Icon webinar series, I would like to thank the Icon Book and Paper group for organizing and setting them up, as this is a really amazing way to stay all connected, share knowledge, and support each other while we stay at home. Just a few housekeeping announcements before we start. If you are using social media platforms, we do encourage you to use the hashtag conservation together at home. This webinar is recorded and will be made available at the Book and Paper Group website as soon as possible after the talk is over. And remember that we are all using our home internet, so please bear with us with any technical issues along the way. If for any reason you drop out the webinar, you will be able to rejoin using the same link that you joined before. Please also do feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to basically type in any questions along the way. And we will have time at the end of the talk to address any questions. And now I would like to introduce you our speaker for today, Louise Porter. Louise Porter is a photographer and artist based in London. From 2014 to 2019, he worked in the photography department of the London College of Communication, where he established a research based into historical photographic processes. He has exhibited his work and undertaken artist residencies internationally. Most recently, he was the 2019 artist in resident at the Awagami paper factory in Japan. He currently runs a photography studio at the Postal Museum in London, is part of the Imaging Standard Special Interest Group of the Association of Heritage and Fine Art Photography, and is a member of the artist book Cooperative. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Luis, which I'll unmute him. And go ahead, Luis.
Hello, thank you, Liz. Okay, I'll start my timer on my talk. Thank you for coming along, everyone, even though I can't see any of you. And I think before I begin, I'd like to quickly thank the Book and Paper Group and the Photographic Materials Group Committee for inviting me and organising this talk. Much appreciated. I'd also like to quickly acknowledge the imaging department of the Wellcome Library, in particular Richard Everett, its manager, Thomas Cox and Laurie Ortolani for their kind and invaluable assistance in helping me with this project. This paper is an edited version of one delivered at the annual conference of the Association for Heritage and Fine Art Photography. It examines the historical underpinning and development of a research-based approach to producing facsimile albumen prints of the work of Victorian photographer John Thomson, using the modest facilities of the Design Photography Department of the London College of Communication. The aim was to create high-quality prints with a simple system using widely available materials that could be undertaken by other institutions and individuals with limited means. Although most of you listening to this presentation will no doubt be well aware of the finer technical points of photographic processes I will discuss, I hope you will forgive me for maintaining, for the most part, the more generalist and inclusive tone of the original paper. I have, however, made several adjustments to take into account the different audience. The use of facsimiles has a long history in the display of historical photographic material, and few large exhibitions of 19th century photography are completely devoid of some form of replica. One of the first photographs visitors to the Photography Centre at the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford will see is a facsimile of Henry Fox Talbot's 1835 photogenic drawing negative of the lattice window at Laycock Abbey. You can see it's rather small on the screen, but it's there. Likewise, visitors to the Musée Nicephore Niepce in the inventor's hometown of Chalon-sur-Saône will encounter his famous view from the window at Le Grand in the form of a copy, whilst the original is housed in Texas at the Harry Ransom Center. And I actually asked them to send me a picture of the replica and they sent me a picture of the original, which I found quite ironic. Although modern facsimiles are produced using mainly digital chromogenic or inkjet printers, companies such as the Chicago Albumen works offer the ability to create process-accurate copies of early photographic material by using copy negatives for contact printing produced using LVT film recorders and traditional silver halide film. Entirely digital replicas of material are becoming more common, and perhaps the most inventive examination of their potential is by the artist Matt Collishaw, whose 2017 exhibition Thresholds at Somerset House recreated Fox Talbot's 1839 display of photography at King Edward's School in Birmingham as an immersive virtual reality experience. When reviewing the exhibition for Frieze magazine, writer Laurie Taylor declared, "Collishaw has not recreated an historical experience, but has instead constructed an entirely new one." This statement hints at a potentially disruptive relationship between an original and its reproduction. For example, although fidelity is an important part of many aspects of cultural heritage photography, techniques such as multispectral and reflectance transformation imaging can provide such an abundance of information that it could be argued an entirely new object has been created. Ironically, the fragility of early photographic material can throw this relationship into sharp relief, something I believe can be illustrated by an example involving a particularly significant photograph. When in October 1839, the French photographer Louis Daguerre presented King Ludwig I of Bavaria with a signed and framed triptych of recently produced daguerreotypes, he entrusted the king with what could be considered one of the most significant artifacts in the medium's history. The right-hand image of the triptych, labelled 8 heures du matin, depicts the view of the Boulevard du Temple from Daguerre's Paris studio. Even in full sun, an early daguerreotype required several minutes of exposure, a necessity that emptied the final image of any moving pedestrians or vehicles. On this occasion, however, in the bottom left-hand corner, the blurred likeness of two figures can be seen, engaged in the act of providing and receiving a shoe shine. As a result, Daguerre's street scene is widely regarded as the earliest photograph of a human being. After Daguerre presented the triptych to the Bavarian king, it was shown with great acclaim at the Munich Arts Association. But rapid advances in photography quickly distracted the public's attention, and the triptych, like the mini-disc or Betamax of its day, soon found itself festering in the back of the royal cupboard before eventually being transferred to the Bavarian National Museum, where a young photographic curator, Bowman Newell, rediscovered Daguerre's triptych and, recognizing its significance, ordered high-quality reproductions of two of the daguerreotype plates for a 1937 exhibition marking nearly 100 years of photography's invention at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It is at this point the disruptive relationship between the original and its copy begins to evolve. By the time Newell encountered the Munich triptych, the fragile surface of the daguerreotype had already begun to degrade, and in the chaos of the war that was soon to follow, their storage and care was far from optimal, and significant further degradation occurred. In 1970, the triptych was presented on long-term loan to the Stadtmuseum in Munich, where in 1972, an attempt was begun to restore the daguerreotypes. This proved to be a disaster, so much so that in 1974, the director of the museum, Marian Schwabig, wrote in Photo magazine that the first surviving photograph of a human being was discolored beyond recognition by external influences. It is not, however, this image of a blistered metal plate that we see reproduced in the innumerable histories of photography, published in books, articles, and on websites. Instead, it is the reproductions that Newell commissioned in 1936 that we're familiar with. Even the facsimiles that hang in the museum today were produced from Newell's original copies. For me, the story of the Boulevard du Temple daguerreotypes is a poignant example of one generation of photographic technology fading into another. It also demonstrates the cultural significance that the act of photographic reproduction can have. In 2016, I established a small alternative and historical photographic processing space at the London College of Communication. An interest in alternative photographic processes has long existed at the peripheries of professional and amateur photographic practice. A desire, perhaps, to not lose touch with the magic of photo alchemy in the sense of being part of a tradition of invention and adaptation. Alternative processes generally encompass the diverse array of photographic techniques largely developed over the course of the 19th century that represent the wide upper branches of photography's technological family tree. Almost all are hand-produced. This is often their allure, and for the most part, they rely on the light sensitivities of compounds of silver, iron, and chromium, although many other elements, such as gold, mercury, copper, uranium, palladium, and of course platinum, form the basis of a myriad of fascinating, beautiful processes. At present, there is a considerable revival of interest in these processes, and subsequent demand has arisen within many photographic degree courses. Ironically, this demand has been driven by the wide availability of information from YouTube videos to scans of contemporaneous manuals that the digital age has afforded. When developing the facility, I wanted it to become a space for directly engaging with the materiality of photographic history, to look for ways that it might inform contemporary arts practice, and also ways contemporary techniques and ideas might help us shed light on our photographic heritage. To enable this, I was awarded a small research grant by the college to explore ways of creating process-specific surrogates using the college's facilities. In particular, I wanted to incorporate digital printing technologies into the workflow, specifically through the production of digital negatives. I also wanted to use the resources at my disposal to engage with other institutions, including those dealing with the conservation and dissemination of early photographic materials. For example, one small project involved collaborating with Lauren Ashley Irving, the conservator at the Victorian and Albumen Museum, who I had previously supplied with a variety of bronzing samples. Lauren was interested in doing some fade testing of stabilized salt prints, and I offered to provide some samples to experiment with. Salted paper printing is the earliest form of positive paper printing. A sheet of sized paper is coated or submerged in a lightly concentrated solution of salt, for example, sodium or ammonium chloride, dried, and in subdued light, coated with a solution of silver nitrate, sometimes with a citric acid restrainer, which upon contact with the salt forms light-sensitive silver halide. Once dry, the paper is then contact printed under a source of ultraviolet light. Before the near universal adoption of John Herschel's suggestion of using sodium thiosulfate, or hypo, as a fixing agent, a number of methods were used for the stabilizing of the photographic image. These included the use of solutions of potassium iodide, potassium bromide, common salt, and even in the case of Brazilian inventor Hercule Florence, a derivative of urine. Sample prints were made using several of these methods, and the aim was to produce prints that were as chemically close to the originals as possible, including the paper. And my choice of print was fairly arbitrary. I've just always been a particular fan of the Nelson's column photograph, so I apologize for that. Recipes were developed by consulting contemporaneous accounts, such as Robert Hunt's treatise on photography, lab notebooks, for example, Talbot's P&Q, journal articles, and modern specialists. For the paper itself, I wanted to get as chemically close as possible to Whatman's turkey bill, given Talbot's positive opinion of it in Notebook P. However, lacking the analytical tools and samples of the original paper, this was no mean feat, especially as the original production method was a trade secret, and in the words of Mark Osterman, photographic process historian at George Eastman Museum, to publish that type of information would have resulted in drawing and quartering back then. Fortunately, contemporaneous publications on the manufacture of paper do give general guidance as to the ratios of alum to gelatin for tub sizing. So an average solution was prepared, and Burger Cot, a modern, chemical-free cotton rag designed for use with photochemistry, was prepared for the tests. The research methodologies developed in smaller projects such as this laid the foundation for the Thomson project, which I will now begin to discuss. The inspiration for the Thomson project came in April 2018 at an exhibition of Thomson's photographs at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. The exhibition, entitled China and Siam, Through the Lens of John Thomson, featured digital photographs reproduced from the Wellcome Library's collection of collodion glass plate negatives of Thomson's work in China and Southeast Asia. What struck me about the prints was their scale. All were considerably larger than the original negatives. The level of detail in some of the prints was extraordinary, due to the imperceptible grain of the wet plate collodion process Thomson used. I was, however, surprised at the exclusion of any original photographic material in the exhibition, and resolved to find out more. After Thomson's death in 1921, the pharmacist, entrepreneur, and avid collector Henry Wellcome purchased nearly 700 of Thomson's Claudian glass negatives. Yet despite this significant collection, the Wellcome possesses only one of Thomson's original Albumen prints. As historian Geoffrey Batchen has noted, negatives can enable an interesting reproductive economy that in turn can create a historical distortion of a photographer's practice. Batchen cites the example of the 2003 survey exhibition of Diane Arbus's work at the San Francisco Museum of Art, in which curators had some of Arbus's previously unseen negatives printed and exhibited in the exhibition. A more pertinent example, in this case, might be August Sander's Men Without Masks, a series of oversized prints of Sander's work made by his son Gunther several years after his father's death, intended as a way to introduce Sander's work to a new audience. And of course, I'm sure we've all seen the originals before, and they're much, much smaller, of course, and a very different thing. It should therefore be unsurprising that the Wellcome negatives have produced a wide variety of photographic material outputs and engage in an equally wide variety of audiences. For example, in 1981, the Wellcome produced a series of silver gelatin contact prints directly from the glass plate negatives, and in 1997, the negatives were once again used to directly produce copies. This time, gold-toned albumen prints produced by then curator of the Fox Talbot Museum, Michael Gray, for an exhibition at the National Library of Scotland. By 2007, changes in conservation practices and advances in digital technologies meant that potentially damaging reproduction methods were neither desirable nor necessary, and the photographic department of the library developed a strategy for digitising the Thomson negatives that avoided any unnecessary handling of the fragile glass plates and created digital copies that would remain in service long into the future. In his report on the project, Wellcome Library photographer Thomas Cox describes in detail the method for producing 1000 pixel per inch flatbed scans of the negatives using a Kodak IQ Smart 3 scanner, after which monochromatic RGB positives were created using the black and white levels dialog in Adobe Photoshop. The resulting 550 megabyte files reveal an extraordinary amount of detail and form the basis of the high-resolution images that the Wellcome makes freely available via its website. It is this seductive cornucopia of detail that inspired curator Betty L to commission a series of oversized prints of Thomson's Chinese work for an exhibition in Beijing in 2009 that has in one form or another toured to this day and was on display when I entered the SARS gallery in April 2018. The Wellcome's collection of Thomson negatives offered a perfect pilot study for testing a simplified method for producing process-accurate surrogate material. Firstly, the Wellcome possessed a large amount of negatives but no contemporaneously produced positives. It had high-resolution scans whose acquisition was well documented, and the original equipment was still in good working order. Lastly, the modern silver gelatin and albumen contact prints provided useful reference points. However, it is John Thomson himself that provided much of the useful information for the study. Thomson is widely regarded as one of Britain's most significant early photographers, one of the founders of documentary photography, his landscapes, social studies, and in particular his portraits still resonate with contemporary audiences. His 1877 publication, Street Life in London, a collaboration with journalist Adolph Smith Headingley, starkly but humanely brought the plight of the urban poor to the English middle classes, and is considered one of the foundational works of photojournalism. But it was more than a decade earlier, whilst living and travelling in China and Southeast Asia, that Thomson cut his teeth as a photographer and began to develop a considerable reputation among a Victorian public eager for knowledge of distant lands. Relatively little is known about Thomson's early days. He was born in Edinburgh in 1837, the son of a tobacconist. He grew up in Portland Place, then an area mostly of tradespeople and shopkeepers. And despite his relatively modest background, he secured an apprenticeship as an optician, a respectable trade in Victorian Britain, and one that would have given Thomson a good grounding in many of the skills he would need as a photographer, and as we shall see, a technical understanding that would come in useful for this project. Despite lack of direct evidence, it is likely that Thomson was apprenticed to James Mackey Bryson, who was also a member of the Photographic Society of Edinburgh, and through him, it is suggested that Thomson came into contact with photography. Regardless, Although Thomson qualified as an optician, he never traded as one, instead setting off in 1862 to join his brother William in Singapore, and on the 22nd of April, a notice of his arrival appeared in the Strait Times. Despite practically having Singapore to himself, with only one other registered photographic business on the island, an economic downturn was pushing many of his potential clients to the wall, and soon Thomson found himself undertaking a series of photographic expeditions into the surrounding region. One of these journeys took Thomson to the court of Siam, modern Thailand, where he photographed the eccentric King Mongkut, both in traditional Siamese regal robes and in the uniform of a French field marshal. Thomson also produced numerous images of Bangkok and the surrounding area, and with the help of 2 Madras assistants, he began to produce and sell albumen prints of his travel photographs. For example, a considerable number of Thomson's prints appear in an album compiled by Bangkok-based businessman Franklin Bale, which is now part of the Gilman collection in New York. Through King Mongkut, Thomson secured a letter of approval to undertake an expedition to photograph the ancient temple of Angkor Wat. The journey through the forbidding Cambodian jungle was arduous, involving, as Thomson would later relay in his memoir, leeches, malaria, rain, wild animals, rebellious porters as well. King Mongkut's letter helped secure some elephants, and eventually the expedition reached the ancient temple complex. I think this is the actual elephants too. It was here that Thomson became the first person to photograph Angkor Wat, an accolade that had he arrived a few weeks later, would have belonged to the French photographer Henry Roussel. In full knowledge of his achievement, Thomson returned to Britain, and using photographs from his trips, delivered a series of papers, presented an exhibition of photographs of Angkor Wat at the Architectural Institute in Scotland, and saw the work published as etchings in both the Institute's journal and later the Illustrated London News. Thomson almost immediately gained a reputation as a capable writer and photographer, and in early 1867, the publishers Edmonston and Douglas released Thomson's first photographic publication, The Antiquities of Cambodia. The book featured 16 albumen prints accompanied by Thomson's description of the site. 2 composite panoramas appear in The Antiquities of Cambodia. The first, which you see here, of these presents a view of the iconic western facade of the temple. It is this panorama I decided to reproduce for the project. Although The Antiquities of Cambodia is far from Thomson's best work, it has nevertheless established Thomson's reputation as a maker of photographic books and helped him return east, relocate his business to Hong Kong, and set about making the photographs of China that would make him famous. What makes the Cambodian work particularly useful for consideration is that during his 1866 return to Britain, Thomson found time to write a series of articles for the British Journal of Photography entitled Practical Photography in the Tropical Regions. These articles provide a detailed account of Thomson's photographic methodology at the time he produced his Angkor Wat images, and formed an excellent basis for developing a system for producing surrogate albumen prints from the scans of his negatives. The basic principle of using digital negatives is that the materials and process are calibrated to reproduce the tonal range of a digital image. Therefore, the first thing I needed to ascertain was if the scans of the glass plates were a faithful reproduction of the tonal range they would represent to a sensitized sheet of albumen paper. Early photographic processes were primarily sensitive to ultraviolet light, generally peaking around 365 nanometers. As this wavelength lies beyond human vision and scanners are calibrated, for the most part, to record visible light, it was possible that the light-sensitive silver halide of the albumen paper would effectively see the collodion negatives differently. Without referring to the fragile original glass plates, I decided to create test charts using Thomson's wet collodion process and compare the UV transmission of various density patches with the results of scanning them using the same equipment and method as the original scans. To aid this process, the Wellcome kindly transferred their scanner to my workspace at the college and forwarded me copies of the available raw scans. The original right-hand negative didn't appear to be part of the collection, but a very similar one was available. The left-hand negative had experienced noticeable damage to the edges, but thankfully, the majority of the image area was intact. The wet collodion process Thomson used in the rainforest of Southeast Asia was largely similar to that used in the more temperate European climate. It involved pouring a mixture of pyroxene, similar to gun cotton, ether, alcohol, and salts onto a clean glass plate. The ether and alcohol quickly evaporated, forming a thin layer of clear nitrocellulose, and the plate was then submerged in a bath of silver nitrate to form a milky, light-sensitive emulsion. The plate was then inserted into a wooden holder and then exposed in camera and taken to be developed whilst wet. Ferrous sulfate was commonly used as a developer in Europe, although its tendency to oxidize rapidly in hot climates meant that Thomson switched to using the more stable ammonium ferrous sulfate. Once fixed and washed, negatives were usually chemically intensified with pyrogallic acid to improve density, and after drying, a protective varnish was applied. The need for development immediately after exposure required photographers working in the field to take entire darkrooms with them wherever they wanted to take photographs. Thomson, for example, used a teepee constructed from black cotton and bamboo that doubled as a cover for his equipment when traveling. For photographers working in the tropics and other hot climates, the low boiling point of ether posed an added difficulty. I think it's at 35 degrees. Thomson developed his own formula for collodion with a larger portion of less volatile alcohol and primarily cadmium salts to improve its keeping stability. I recreated Thomson's collodion recipe in my lab at the college and used it to photograph a large inkjet printed test chart at various exposures. Fortunately, Thomson gave detailed processing formulas in his 5th article for the British Journal of Photography, and I followed these as closely as I practically could. However, I did, for example, omit the use of potassium cyanide fixer for safety reasons. The fixer's primary advantages are speed and the need for only a brief post-fix wash treatment. So whilst ideal for working in the field, sodium thiosulfate is, in my opinion, the better option for this kind of experiment. The test plates were then scanned using the Wellcome's IQ Smart 3 scanner, oxygen software, and the techniques specified in Thomas Cox's technical report. The positive images were then converted to grayscale, a space I find more practical to use when making digital negatives. The patches of the scanned test plates were then averaged in Photoshop and recorded. For the sake of consistency, I decided to use an artificial light source rather than the sun of 4 UVA fluorescent tubes mounted into a spare studio light. To measure the UV transmission of the test chart, I placed the sensor of a UVA light meter under each patch of the glass plate, taking care to take the reading from the same point under the light. Thankfully, a graphical representation of the two showed us similar patterns. The peak, that's an error in my coding, so I'm rereading, I think. So I decided to leave the tonal relationships in the scans as they were. I did, however, undertake a small amount of digital restoration to the scan. As with the damaged daguerreotypes of the Munich triptych, our recognition of a photograph is significantly invested in its image, which arguably extends beyond its physical state. I concede, however, that image restoration for many is a contentious subject, but as the digital negative process allows for restoration, I wanted to incorporate some elements into the test project. Producing the digital negatives was done using an Epson 4900 inkjet printer on a specially designed acetate material. To create a detailed negative, the printer uses a range of inks, and these inks are designed for reflective materials, so the UV transmission of the various ink mixes is not necessarily proportional to any increase in ink density. Measuring a printed grayscale step wedge with both the densitometer and the UV light meter demonstrates this. Another factor influencing how a negative is produced is that each process has its own characteristic curve that delivers disproportionate densities to increases in exposure, in particular at the beginning and end or toe and shoulder of the curve. To counter this, an adjustment curve is applied to the image in Photoshop before it is inverted and printed as a negative. This curve alters specific values in the image to ensure they reproduce the correct tone in the final print. This curve is calculated by simply printing and processing an unaltered test chart in exactly the same way as a final print. Once dry, this chart is scanned and the relationship between the claimed and actual patch readings used to devise the curve and the final negative can be devise the curve and the final negatives can then be printed. Here's a final negative. The idea of using egg white for making photographic prints was publicly discussed as early as 1839, but as a specific process, photographer Louis Blanquart Everard is credited with its invention in 1850. Egg whites are whipped together with acetic acid and salt, usually ammonium chloride, and left to denature into a smooth-flowing, clear yellow liquid. In Europe, this was often allowed to age for some days to weeks before use. My current batch is several months old and works beautifully, albeit pungently. A piece of finest writing paper, usually a blend of linen and cotton rag, was then floated on top of a dish of albumen, then dried in a warm environment, giving a rich sheen to the paper. This was then sensitized with a solution of silver nitrate, whose strength corresponded to the ratio of salt to albumen, dried, then exposed as a contact print, toned, washed and fixed. Thomson does not give recipes or his technique for making albumen prints in the British Journal of Photography articles. However, a number of other sources were used to approximate his methodology. For example, in 1872, Thomson provided a series of English to Chinese translations of photographic chemicals and apparatus for Justice Doolittle's Vocabulary and Handbook of the Chinese Language. This invaluable resource sheds a great deal of light on the materials Thomson would have used, and I decided to limit my own use of chemicals to those mentioned in the list. Another useful source is Thomson's 1875 translation of Gaston Tissandier's A History and Handbook of Photography. This publication helped cement Thomson's reputation as a technically accomplished photographer and sold widely. The British Journal of Photography stating in its review that a copy should find a place on the shelves of every photographer's library. Importantly, alongside the translation of Tissandier's text, Thomson includes footnotes and appendices with a variety of methods and formulae of his own. Most useful were two recipes for gold toner Thomson gives. Gold toning of albumen prints was standard practice and had a significant influence on the final appearance of the print. Tones would range from warm browns to purple, slate grey, aubergine, and even black. By the 1860s, gold toning involved the use of a weak solution of acidic gold chloride that had been made slightly alkaline. The substance used to change the pH influenced the tone achieved. I decided to use Thomson's recipe for a sodium bicarbonate-based toner, as it is reliable and does not require chemical ripening. Once clean, the prints were dried between blotting paper, pressed, trimmed, and then attached to card using Jin Shofu wheat starch paste. Although time has claimed some portions of the original negatives, especially the left hand of the triptych, I believe that the final result presents a good approximation of how the original triptych may appear. That's how I store them in my little box. Despite the use of gold and silver, the final cost of making an albumen print is reasonable. A digital negative costing about £2.50 and each print £2. Most of the equipment is fairly simple, and weather permitting, the sun can replace the need for artificial UV light. The chemicals are reasonably safe to use and correctly handled and disposed of. However, I would recommend that for any experimentation involving wet collodion, unless necessary, cadmium salts should be substituted for salts of potassium. Although I concede that the future of the reproduction of early photographic material is mostly digital, I hope this project demonstrates that this does not necessarily mean a future without a place or a value for the skills and materials that our forebears considered essential. Thank you. Now, I appear to...
Great.
Yes, that was good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luis, for that. That was very, very interesting. I wanted to ask you, so we do have a few questions. So the negatives that you created already,
yes.
Are they? Is it like at the Wellcome library at the moment?
So the original scans of the negatives are available online via the Wellcome library. Although the scans, I actually use the raw scans, which are essentially, they have no data editing, which the Wellcome, the imaging department actually sent me. So although they are available, they've all been tweaked to sort of look better on screen, the publicly available ones. So I actually was using, it was important to use the raw ones in the process because I didn't want to have any added data, if you saw what I mean. So they was as close as possible to a sort of raw information as I could get.
Thanks for that. Let's go and answer some of the questions basically. So Mariska asked what kind of Kodak scanner was used by Thomas Cox.
It's an IQ3 smart scanner. I can double check in my notes, but yes, it's an IQ3, I think. Let's have a look. I think it's changed its name over time. You can actually still get them, and they're relatively reasonable price, to be frank with you. Yes, it's an IQ Smart 3 scanner.
Okay. And next question is by Stephanie Jameson. I'm interested in your work experimenting with salt. With salt printing facilities and salt printing fading. So she's asking, did you publish any of your findings?
Not yet. So essentially, after I'd finished that project and work, the next thing I did, as we discussed before, was I went to Awagami to do some work there involving calotype. So I haven't had the chance to actually sort of come back and think of publishing anything to do with the salt print project I was working on, but I'd quite like to actually, because it's a very interesting subject.
Thanks. Another question is from an anonymous. He says, I'm curious about the Jeffrey Batson reference mentioned, and if you can cite the source for that, please. Remember, you can always like...
yeah, can you email me about that? It is a tricky source to find, and I actually, it's online. It's from a series of online conversations he was having with a gallery in Germany, partly to do with the negative. I know that Batson has been, I don't know if he has yet, thinking of publishing a book on the negative, which I think will be fascinating when he does, and he's done some talks around it. But basically, I came across this via this conversation. So if they can email me, I promise to track it down and forward the link, because I have difficulty finding it myself, to be honest.
I just share your email on the chat as well, so people please feel free to contact me straight away. And another question is, Mariska, thanks for the interesting talk. And would you maybe like to share examples, some of the earlier techniques for copying photographs?
For copying photographs? My knowledge of that is relatively limited. I know that Talbot was particularly fascinated in looking at photomechanical reproduction systems. But I'm afraid that my knowledge of that is not so great. I think I have seen, and I believe, of course, I think that Niepce himself, of course, was doing a similar thing. And I believe copying was, because of obviously the slowness of the reproduction systems, for a long time, it was thought that photography would be useful as a copying system. So my interest in it has very much always been within photographing in the field, if you sort of mean. So I haven't personally done a great deal of study on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, another very interesting question from Mariska is also, what do you think of the ethics of conservation when they're producing these photographs? And do these photos always have to be in bad condition to do so? Or would you recommend to use this technique at all times? It's a very interesting question from the conservation perspective as well.
I think the ethics is an interesting one. For me, I'm very interested in the materiality of, for want of a better way of putting it, of photography. So I think that having the good fortune to have, say, worked a lot with these processes, there's something very special about having them close to you. So I think that a lot of exhibitions would benefit from having salt prints that you could touch and feel. And I think in an early conversation I had with Lauren, we actually discussed the idea you could have maybe a stabilized salt print, for instance, with a covering on it, so you could see it fading through the exhibition. You know, one side is covered and you'd lift it up. And I think that having a physical object that isn't necessarily precious in an exhibition context is a very interesting thing. And as well, for me, the surface of an albumen print is it's a beautiful thing if you touch it. Secondly, as well, a fresh albumen looks very different from one that is obviously, you know, well over 100 years old. So again, I mean, I also think that from having made them, before the albumen is washed and fixed, it is one of the most beautiful things you'll ever see. So the richness of these things. So I would love to see more of this in exhibitions. I think it's a real shame we don't do that. And I think part of that is perhaps to do with this idea that it sort of dilutes the material. You know, there's this idea, well, if, you know, are you getting close to forging something or trying to displace the original object, which of course is not the idea. I think in photography you could have much more of a sense of the object and a look and feel kind of thing going on, and I think that's where the facsimile or the surrogate has a really interesting part to play.
I think, yeah, definitely, like replacing, it's not about replacing the original object, but I just wanted to add as well that what you said about making the prints and making even like seeing how they fade, it's a great way for educational purposes as well, in conservation, for people to understand how easy for photographs to fade and how different they were back when they were made and how they look now.
For instance, a lot of albumen papers were essentially coloured, dyed. You know, they would be pink albumen papers, which of course a lot of these dyes have faded. So I think we have a concept, or a lot of people, the general public has a concept of a sort of nostalgia connected to these types of images. But there's modernity there, you know, which I think we're missing. I mean, these are exciting technological movements that were occurring, and the photography was very important to that. And so I think, yeah, for me, I think having a fresh feel to some of this material is the potential for it with these processes is there and exciting.
Definitely adds another perspective. Another question is, have you or will you share your albumen recipe? And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if someone, I'd happily forward it to anyone who asks it.
And I didn't catch this information that you say.
Yeah,
so yeah,
it's all written down, and I think I have somewhere like an Excel sheet that I can send which has all the times and it's condensed, but of course it's not a trade secret.
Okay. Another question. Thank you, Louise. I was wondering if you managed to compare any of your prints with older prints. I know they are probably faded, but I've been interested to know how you feel look by comparison.
Well, yes. I mean, obviously it's hard to know how much they faded, but so I'm a member of the London Library, and the Thomson actually produced some albumen prints for the China magazine, I believe was the name of it. And it was, I think, the earliest photographically illustrated publication produced in China. I'm not 100% sure of that, but it's a magazine, but a relatively small thing. There's maybe in each edition of it, and it's a very rare publication to the best of my knowledge, but the London Library has a copy. And of course, it's a lending library, so I was able to borrow a copy of this. Towards the center of the copy that I borrowed, there were some prints that I think had fared very, very well indeed. You know, others had faded to varying degrees, but I did manage to take them in to the lab when I was actually testing the various toning recipes to decide which one to go with. And personally, I'm quite happy with the comparison. But of course, I don't know how it's faded or aged. I mean, it's not my area of expertise by far. But I was quite happy. Yeah, there was a warm richness to them, in terms of the coloration, which I don't know if your screens, I can't tell if everyone's screens are calibrated, but a slight sort of brown purple quality, which I felt was resonated. So I'm confident that they're not a bad look.
Great, we're doing quite well with time. Another question from Michael Pritchard. When you went back to the original formula, where were the biggest discrepancies when you replicated them? Were modern chemicals too pure, for example?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and in a way, I would like to have spent a lot more time on that. So I think either there was some slight discrepancies. Perhaps the purity of the salts that he was using in his collodion recipe might have been slightly different. I did find that the recipe required a considerable amount of settling, more than I would have expected. It had a very high level of ethanol in it, which made sense. But I did find it quite a difficult collodion to use, to be frank. And from having looked at some of his original plates, I don't know, I got the sense that maybe there was a slight sort of difference in there, not so much in the composition, but the way everything was mixing together. And obviously, I think, again, in terms of toning, I can't tell 100% for sure what access to what kind of gold chloride he would have had. It wasn't uncommon for photographers to take gold sovereigns, chuck them in the acid bath, put it on the hob in the oven, on the kitchen, and run out the door whilst all the fumes came out. So you get all sorts of stuff left in that. So it's really hard to tell that for certain. And I mean, I would love the equipment to start, really looking at the work to see whatever bits were there. So I had to a certain degree, trust in that his chemicals were a rough approximation of the ones I was using.
Yeah, it's always like with historical recipes as well.
They're fun to use, but yeah, there's lots of room for error, I'm afraid.
Another question from Nicholas Barnett. May I ask which paper you used as support for the albumen prints? Yeah,
good question. And I'm not alone in this. Canson Crob, which is essentially, I think it's like a cartridge paper. It's quite a relatively cheap paper. The annoying thing is that they made an 80 GSM paper that gave the most incredible finish. So I can't sort of say that these are in themselves archival objects, but perhaps they don't need to be, so they are surrogates. But Canson has changed the paper slightly. So although I have a stock, and for this project I use the 80 GSM, for people who are maybe trying it themselves, they will have to use the new stock, which still seems to work quite well. But again, if someone actually wants to do this, maybe via email I can make some recommendations, but of how to account for that slight difference.
Did you say it was 80 GSM?
Yes, if you can find it, basically, I think it's 80 or 85 GSM was an earlier version of the Canson paper, which they discontinued a couple of years ago, but I mean, I'm eating into my stock still. I have got, if you can get the Canson Crob here in the UK, it goes up to A3 sheets, which it does still work very well. But if you can get your hands on the older weight or the lighter weight, that works almost perfectly, that paper. I've never had a problem with that paper. There does tend to be, with a lot of papers, issues with spontaneous blackening and things like that, so that is a very, very versatile paper. But there are many others I can recommend if people are interested. And that was for the albumen prints specifically. I always dreamt of coming across a cotton rag that would fulfill that purpose, that was available in reliable amounts. And that's the problem. There are some mills I've come across which will make in small batches a light sort of 80 to 100 GSM rag that is suitable and gives you a real similar feel, but they're not reliable quantities. It's quite often that they won't have any stock. So, or they make very limited stock and they're quite expensive. And it was important for this project that it was something that could be done on relatively limited means. My paper budget at the college was very good, but I didn't want to come up with a project that a small collection wouldn't be able to do themselves. That was important to me.
Thanks for that. We still have like quite a few questions, and we are doing quite a good day. Maybe like another five minutes.
Yeah, of course.
Another question by Elsa Thais is: how many prints did you make, and are there the same dimensions as the original prints? In terms of how many prints did I make to get it right, I actually don't know. I keep coming across some folders of them all over the place. It's really embarrassing. I kept it as close as I could to the original size. I wanted it to be something that would be suitable to have in place of the object, as close as I could get it. I mean, there's always going to be compromises you make, but I wanted it to be something that gave you
a sense of looking at the original object, you know, and I've done it in sections just to make it portable, if you see what I mean. So you line them up together. I mean, I have others that at some point I want to bind it into a volume of about the same size. But no, I wanted it to be as close as original as possible. I mean, of course, theoretically, I could blow it up. I mean, that's not a problem. But for me, it was about trying to make something that was as close as possible as I could get it.
I was quite impressed, as like a small parenthesis, I was quite impressed by the size of the John Thomson prints that you saw in the exhibition you saw us on the picture. Like, it's just amazing to see how much they can blown up the images from the negative. It's just like really impressive.
I mean, I've always sort of said to my students that this assumption that there was something crude ultimately about the system of reproduction that collodion offered is wrong. I mean, a well-exposed, well sort of set up collodion glass plate photograph, I mean, it's incredible resolution, or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, the detail they're beautiful things when you look at them close. And I wouldn't say that it's bad to have the big versions. I think when I went into the show as someone who's interested in historical photography, I did want to at least see a couple of smaller ones to get a sense of what they were like.
To get the context, that's true. Another question, what do you think is the most difficult aspect of mastering the albumen print process?
All right, easy. Okay, so there was a picture of it in a tray. I'm going to try and get to, yeah, this is a very easy question because it took forever. Let me see, right, there. So the idea is you, I don't know if, can you see my screen? Is it still there, I hope? Anyway, yeah, you're good.
It's so, like on share.
So I'm obviously stood behind that, and there's my smelly egg mix in the tray. And you can see that I've got a light box coming below, because the problem is if you get an air bubble, you're stuffed basically. So you're going to have real problems. So the real issue is you have to drop a piece of paper, ideally on a thin piece of paper, onto that in such a way that it doesn't cause any air bubbles whatsoever, and that it goes on evenly. And then of course you dry it, and you do exactly the same thing again, except this time in subdued light with silver nitrate. And if you have a slight judder or a movement in the process of picking it up and putting it down, you can get streaks and lines of varying densities. And that can come from both varying amounts of the egg white to also varying amounts of the silver nitrate. So it took me, no joke, 3 months to teach myself how to do that. And now I can do it really well, and I'm very proud of myself. But that was, some of my earlier tests were just horrific. So that was really hard. Everything else, easy. And yeah, I mean, once you get that, you can do anything, in my opinion.
Another question by Alexandra Murphy. Could you explain your use of potassium in the salt print process?
In the salt printing process, so potassium iodide is being used as a stabilizer in that process. So what I did for those experiments and tests is I simply went through a large amount of literature from the period, and I'm sort of quite lucky that I have a little bit of a collection of it here, and then I also, because I have modern reproductions of it, and so I collect recipes as you can imagine. And so I simply, that is used as a, I'm afraid off the top of my head I can't remember the percentages, and again, if somebody emails me I can send them references quite happily. That is literally used as a bath, much as you would use as a fixer, and that is just simply let me check actually, I haven't looked for a bit. It's not the best. I mean, it does tend to leave the eye. The problem with the potassium iodide is it discolors the print slightly, so that you wouldn't necessarily want to then use it if you were doing a sort of a photogenic drawing negative or something like that. Because it discolors the material, it's then going to actually act as a filter. So you're going to reduce the ability of that object to then to yield a good print, because effectively you're going to filter out a lot of the good light. But it does stabilize, it will stabilize a print if you run it through. So I've got I sent Lauren my tests, but I kept back some various strips and things like that. And in, I think, a year and a bit, there's been absolutely sort of no change within the folder that I'm keeping it in. So it's worked well. The one that I was surprised at was I did test. Herschel had an idea of just using distilled water, which I well, didn't work very well, but worked better than I expected, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, potassium iodide is a stabilizer, much in the same way that you would use sodium chloride or potassium bromide. But the color is awful. That's probably why it's not a nice color.
I think we are pretty much close to the time to draw a close, I think. There are quite a few more questions. Maybe like, yeah, people just feel free to continue any chat and discussion on social media if you want, using the hashtag as well, conservation together at home. And yeah, also feel free to email Luis. That was really, really interesting, Luis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I think we generated quite a lot of questions, and definitely like we have gone further, especially with ethical.
Right. Yeah. Good. Good. Definitely. Good to know. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining us. And just before we close, just to say, the next webinar will be on Monday by Sue Mossman, talking about textile synthetic transformation. And the next photographic materials webinar will be next Thursday by Susan Klein, talking about Woodbury type, a forgotten 19th century photomechanical process and in its 21st resurrection. So yes, please do join us. And thank you very much again, everyone, for joining us, and Luis for giving this really, really interesting talk.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you very much. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you.